Good afternoon and welcome. You've joined us for Technology in the Seas, Enforcement in Marine Protected Areas. My name is Hannah Keating and I'm the Manager of Education Programs here at ELI. We're delighted to welcome everyone to this ELI 50th Anniversary Seminar. This year marks the official 50th anniversary of the Environmental Law Institute, and ELI is reflecting back on our important work in shaping environmental law and governance. The month of September focuses on technology as an emerging driver for environmental behaviors and conditions. And for more information on our programming and 50th anniversary, please see the events webpage on our website, eli.org, and thank you so much for joining us. At the end of today's panel, we'll have time for a question and answer session, and we encourage you to ask your questions at that time. If you're joining us through GoToWebinar, please submit your questions through GoTo's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send them as soon as you think of them. If you're joining us in the room, we have a microphone to pass around at that time. I would like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their leadership to this program. While they'll be introduced briefly momentarily, their full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I encourage you to check out their expertise and experience in more detail there. Additionally, all the PowerPoint materials are available on our ELI event webpage. As we begin, I would like to briefly introduce today's moderator, João Ricio Blanco. João is the director of the Oceans Program here at the Environmental Law Institute. His current research interests include transparency and access to information in international fisheries, legal reforms to make small fisheries more sustainable, the regulatory implementations of area-based management, and the design and enforcement of marine protected areas. With that, I'd like to warmly turn things over to João to get us started. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much, Hannah. So hello everyone, and welcome to this Environmental Law Institute Ocean Program Seminar on Technology and the Seas, Enforcement in Marine Protected Areas. My name is João Ricio Blanco. As Hannah mentioned, I'm the director of the Ocean Program here at ELI. And it's my real pleasure to be the moderator of this panel today. Thanks so much to every one of you for joining us and for your interest in this topic. I'm going to start by providing a brief intro about the ELI and the Ocean Program seminar series, and I will also share a few general notes on today's topic. We are really happy about the fascinating group of panelists that we have put together, and I will introduce each of them before they speak. I want to start by reiterating a big thanks to all of you and those joining online for joining and participating in this seminar. And I also want to send a special thanks to the Naomi and Nehemiah Cohen Foundation. The Cohen Foundation has supported the ELI Ocean Program seminar and webinar series since its inception, and it has been instrumental in making this happen. Now, before we get to the content and conversation, a few things that Hannah has already also discussed. We will hear the three presentations from the panelists, and we will have time for questions at the end. For those of you joining via webinar, you can ask your questions at any time, typing your questions in the dialog box that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And we will compile the questions and post them to the panelists after the presentations. And of course, we will try to get as many questions as we can. Now, a few notes on the Environmental Law Institute. We are a non-partisan independent research center that was founded in the summer of '69. I love using this picture to illustrate the year ELI was founded, although I know that it's getting less and less funny, and I'm not able to find many fans of Brian Adams out there. But the truth is that my ELI colleague, Carl Brook, who is the director of our international programs, mentioned that this other picture might illustrate a lot better what the idea of when was ELI founded. ELI was founded the same year the Beatles released Abbey Road, which is also the same year that NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the first major statute of environmental law, was passed. And of course, this also means that 2019, this year, marks ELI's 50th anniversary. At ELI, we analyze environmental and natural resources management challenges, and we seek to provide avenues for most effective stewardship. We are a small research center, so we usually cooperate with other research centers, universities, and NGOs to develop our work. We do not engage in lobbying, and we worked both domestically and internationally. Now, that being said, of course, we do have opinions on matters of environmental concern. And for example, it is a basic premise of our ocean program that the marine environment is vulnerable and must be protected. And the need for adequate protection of marine biodiversity is what brings us precisely to today's topic. I would like to start with one quote that some of you might identify, especially if you like old movies. Here we have James Mason playing Captain Nemo in the 1954 film 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And so Captain Nemo says, "The sea does not belong to despots. Upon its surface, men can still exercise unjust laws, fight, tear one another to pieces, and be carried away with terrestrial horrors. But at 30 feet below its level, their reign ceases, their influence is quenched, and their power disappears." So we have Captain Nemo, which is a pioneer ocean preservationist with some blunt methods. Unfortunately, we now know that the ocean is in fact deeply altered by the actions of our, in quote unquote, inland kingdoms in ways we still struggle to understand. At 30 feet below, the mark of human actions does not vanish. Plastic bags have been found at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on Earth. Marine biodiversity is in constant threat with worrisome massive collapses and the threat of disappearance of some of the most iconic marine species. All around the world, fisheries are failing, changing whole ecosystems and sending thousands to unemployment, poverty, and hunger. To respond to this challenge, in recent years, countries have enacted many new marine protected areas that, in theory, protect thousands of square miles of ocean space. However, budgets for environmental compliance and enforcement on a global scale are not increasing at the rate that would allow MPA management and enforcement agencies to keep the pace on this expansion of areas of protection at sea. This adds to the current challenges of monitoring vast marine spaces with limited means, budget, and staff. In this context, ocean protection commitments are at risk of becoming no more than window dressing. And this is one reason why technological innovation for MPA management and enforcement is so important. The availability of remote sensing technologies is already changing the patterns of conduct of illegal actors, raising transparency on the use and abuse of ocean resources, and facilitating ocean enforcement operations. Technologies can also do all these things while at the same time capturing useful data to estimate the health of the ocean and providing information that keeps seafarers safer when out at sea. To completely fulfill its promise, these technologies need to be coupled with training, adequate budgetary and regulatory support. And I will conclude this introduction with a short note on ELI's work in this field. Most declarations of new MPAs in recent years have been made as a response to international commitments, international pledges. However, these multilateral duties do not specifically require regulatory measures to ensure effective implementation of these new areas of protection. So, seeking to shed some light on this situation, in late 2016, the Environmental Law Institute, thanks to the support of the National Geographic Society, developed a handbook of legal tools and approaches for effective MPA enforcement. And we had the pleasure of having John as one of the members of our consultative committee in that project. The handbook is available for download on our website, www.eli.org. And with that, my short introduction is over, and I will go ahead and introduce you to today's panelists. We are lucky to have a truly remarkable group of experts here with us. I will provide just a brief introduction about each of them. before they speak. And I'm really grateful to the three panelists for agreeing to spend some time with us today and share with us your views and your expertise on the role of technology in MPA management and ocean monitoring and enforcement. And with that, I will introduce our first panelist, Win Carney. Win is a special agent at the Office of Law Enforcement of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He has worked in law enforcement for 19 years in locations as distant as Georgia, the Everglades, Alaska, and the Mid-Atlantic. He holds an undergrad degree in criminal justice and a Master of Public Administration from Georgia Southern University. Win, all yours.
Thank you. So yeah, so I worked in the Everglades for a while, and the state, or the bird of the Everglades is the mosquito. Kind of like one of your stories earlier, John. We had to run back and forth to the home from the vehicle so we wouldn't get covered with mosquitoes. But yes, I work with NOAA Fisheries Office of Law Enforcement, and I work here at our headquarters office in Silver Spring. I've been in the field for many years, and now I'm working as our domestic operations program manager. At the Office of Law Enforcement, we have an international side, and we have a domestic side. I'm on the domestic side. So a lot of liaison work, a lot of policy work, a lot of procedures, looking at regulations, looking at new laws, and reviewing electronic technologies, looking at electronic technologies and seeing what can work and what may not work. So a little bit about NOAA Fisheries enforcement. We do have strategic goals with NOAA Fisheries enforcement, and these cover sustainable fisheries. Maximizing sustainable fisheries are the fishing opportunities and for fishing communities, while ensuring the sustainability of the fisheries. Recover and conserve protected resources while supporting responsible fishing and resource development, and improve organizational excellence and regulatory efficiency. The middle one there is recover and conserve protected species while supporting responsible fishing and resource development. That's the one that we focus on with our priorities in regards to marine protected areas, national marine sanctuaries, and so forth. What we do from these are the NOAA Fisheries strategic goals. The Office of Law Enforcement takes these goals, and we work with our stakeholders, our partners. That can include our state partners, our federal partners, NGO partners, many partners. And we reach out to those partners and we say, what are your priorities? What do you see as a priority that you want us to work on? And from there, they give us what they want us to work on, and we look at that over our strategic goals and see where they overlap. And that's how we make our priorities. We don't have a lot of resources in today's time, so what we have to do is prioritize what we do and focus on specific things. One of those priorities, and mostly all the divisions of of OLE, Office of Law Enforcement, are marine protected areas and national marine sanctuaries. There aren't any national marine sanctuaries in Alaska, but protected areas, conservation areas is one of the priorities up there. So that is one thing that we have across the board. There's a link here to our priorities, and I think if you go to that link, there's an attachment on the website that you can go to the priorities and see the priorities by each division. And speaking of our divisions, we have 5 divisions within the Office of Law Enforcement, and we cover a great area. Within the Office of Law Enforcement, we have 130 sworn positions, and that includes uniformed officers and special agents who are basically plainclothes enforcement personnel. The special agents are doing more of our complex investigations, seafood fraud, working IUU, illegal imports coming in. If somebody shoots a dolphin, if somebody shoots a turtle, we're looking at those more complex investigations. Our uniformed officers are working more in the field, working boarding boats, conducting patrols, monitoring, and investigations. They do a lot more interaction with our state partners, our joint enforcement agreement partners, which I'll talk about in a little while, the Coast Guard, and other partners that we have, like Customs and Border Protection at the ports of entry. So we do have OLE divisions everywhere from Alaska, the Pacific Islands, the West Coast, the Southeast, and the Northeast. Our U.S. primary jurisdiction is 3.36 million square miles of open ocean. and that's hard to do with 130 people. So we do have to have our partnerships in place, our collaboration, and our priorities. There's a lot of things we can work. So if we don't focus on specific priorities, specific areas, then we'll just be going everywhere like a shotgun round that's going off and just spreading all over the wall. So we want to focus within these areas. We do have, I did change the slide before I came here. We did have 13 national marine sanctuaries. Now we have 14 national marine sanctuaries with Mallows Bay being added, and 4 marine national monuments. High seas and international trade related to U.S. treaties and international law. We do enforce those as well. Now, in addition to all of that geographical jurisdiction, we have laws that are enforced by NOAA fisheries, and there are approximately 40 laws that we enforce, which is different than a lot of other organizations. Some organizations may have one law that they enforce, and within that law, they can do a lot of things. We have 40 laws, and the main ones that we have are the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Lacey Act, and Illegal, Unreported, Unregulated Fishing Enforcement Act. Now, these aren't all the acts that we enforce. There are many more, but these are the main ones that we enforce pretty much in all of the divisions. Specifically, for example, we could have the North Pacific Halibut Act that's enforced on the West Coast in Alaska, but that's specific just to that area. Within each one of these acts, we have different statutes, different authorities, different boarding authorities, different authorities to search, to seize, and so forth. So talking about our priorities, how do we accomplish our priorities? Outreach and compliance assistance is a lot of what we do every day. And this, what I'm doing today, is outreach and compliance assistance. So just everyday talking informally, it doesn't necessarily have to be formally, is compliance assistance and outreach. A lot of times we go to fishing shows, we go to boat shows, just walking on the dock and talking to the fishermen is how we get a lot of our compliance assistance out. Investigations, our officers and our agents conduct our investigations. Like I said, the agents conduct more complex investigations. The officers conduct investigations, but they're not as complex. An example of an investigation that's not complex is if you board a boat and you find a bunch of filleted fish on the boat that's not supposed to be filleted. Then you have to figure out why did they fillet them, who filleted the fish, what kind of fish it is, and so forth. That's not as of a long-term investigation. A long-term investigation would be someone who's importing illegal crab meat from another country and bringing it into the United States and marketing the crab meat as U.S. crab meat and not crab meat from another country. That would be more of a complex investigation. So another way is by patrol. Overt patrol is going to be what our officers are doing, and that's right there. You can see our patrol vehicle with our uniformed officer inside of the patrol vehicle at a dock somewhere. Our vehicles are pretty much all the same for our uniform division across the country. So knowing where this picture came from, this came from the Northeast Division, but you could have put this into Alaska and it would be the same vehicle from Alaska. Fords are good, but I may prefer another vehicle over that. Monitor, we monitor things, and I've talked about our enforcement, our sworn staff, but we do have analysts as well too. We have analysts that look at data. We have analysts that look at just information that's coming in and monitoring what's going on, including VMS data. We do look at AIS data as well, and many other things we look at too. So we do have analysts that do look at these types of things. So our partnerships, we have partnerships with our state partners, and through that we have our cooperative enforcement program where we partner with mostly all of the states in the United States that touch the water, from Maine all the way around to Alaska, and including the territories of Puerto Rico, America Samoa, and those places. Federal partnerships, that's going to be U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There is a lot of crossing with NOAA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. For example, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Lacey Act, the Endangered Species Act. With turtles, we have an MOU with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, sea turtles. Fish and Wildlife Service is a primary investigators when it comes to imports or exports of turtles illegally. And as far as domestically, through the MOU, we have primary jurisdiction on any violation that occurs at sea, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has primary jurisdiction of turtles that occur on land. So an example of that is someone stealing turtle eggs from the beach, U.S. Fish and Wildlife or the state agency that occurs in would have primary jurisdiction. If somebody has a turtle excluder device that's not compliant, or that shoots a turtle in a national marine sanctuary or at sea with a spear gun, then we would have primary jurisdiction on that situation. And other federal partners we have are the U.S. Coast Guard, Customs and Border Protection, the FDA, Homeland Security Investigations, and we can keep on and on and on and on. We work closely with a lot of those agencies, including the IRS too. NOAA's Office of General Counsel. NOAA's Office of General Counsel is a general counsel that works in NOAA, our enforcement section. We have two ways of going with the case. We can either go civilly with the case, or we can go criminally with the case. If the case goes civilly and stays in-house with our civil statutes, then that would go to the NOAA's Office of General Counsel enforcement section. If the case is going criminally, then that would go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, U.S. Department of Justice, and that's all across the country as well. So, marine protected areas enforcement. The couple of things I want to talk about here real quick is how do we do it? What's the best way of enforceability of marine protected area enforcement? The first thing is enforceable regulations and laws. We partnership with national marine sanctuaries, with our fishery councils, with our HMS advisory panels. We represent the Office of Law Enforcement when it comes into fishery management areas, ICAT, CAMLAR, those areas like that, and we make sure that any regulation, any law that they're making is going to be enforceable for us and for U.S. Coast Guard. Because if it's not, then a lot of it's a waste of time. Because it's tough with our limited resources to actually get out and enforce a law if we can't enforce it with our laws and regs. We like straight boundary lines, and when it comes with marine protected areas, it's just easier altogether with enforceability and with going to court. I would say if you had a marine protected area that's like an amoeba or shaped something like that, there's probably not much enforceability when it comes to that. One, we can't expect the stakeholder to know where the boundary lines are, and we can't expect ourselves to know where the boundary lines are located. And half the time we have to get a book out and try to figure out where we are in the first place. So we like straight boundary lines, helps things out a lot. Collaboration and partnerships. Prime examples in the Florida Keys, at the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. We have the Coast Guard that enforces laws down there. Monroe County Sheriff's Department enforces laws down there. Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission enforces laws down there. Everybody there working together because we couldn't do it all by ourselves. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well, because within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary or bordering it are lands owned by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service with the Everglades, and so forth. So we have to have our collaboration and to make sure that we're getting things together and we're focusing on certain things. Emerging technologies, we are looking at emerging technologies right now, and there's a lot of different emerging technologies out there. We're trying to figure out which ones are most effective, which ones are most cost effective, and which way we're going to go. And those can be from radars. There's different areas that we have with radars, different state agencies, federal agencies have radars that can tell us where a boat is. We are looking at the satellites, looking to see what we can do with satellites to tell us where boats are located and where they're going, where they've been. Drones, we're looking at drones also. Not as much as the drones that you can sit here and operate from this broom and goes out a little ways. We're looking at drones that can go out a long ways because a lot of these marine protected areas that we have are a long ways out. So how do we get out there? How do we enforce those marine protected areas with limited resources? And all of a sudden they see a big white Coast Guard ship coming and then they stop doing what they're doing. So that's what we're looking at too. VMS, AIS, but not all vessels have AIS and not all vessels have VMS. We just started to look at hydrophones too and see what we can listen to under the water. But all of this is emerging technologies that we're looking at. Each one of these are a tool. Having said that, using just one of these isn't going to give us the prosecution we want. That's why a lot of these, with VMS and AIS, we can see a boat is right there, but what is that boat doing? because a lot of regulations that are out there, the boats are allowed to be there. They just can't be fishing there, or they can't be doing a specific type of fishing there. So with the court system that we have and that we work with, we have to put eyes on those vessels to actually see what they're doing. So all these work great, but getting our eyes on those vessels is a totally different story. And then effectiveness. You know, everything I was talking about before with marine protected areas enforcement, bringing all those together and making sure that it is effective, including our priorities. What we try to do is, for example, recently we had a saturation in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary during mini lobster season. So we went out there and we focused on spas, the sanctuary protected areas. We focused on the other marine protected areas in the area, and we worked collaboratively with the FWC, U.S. Coast Guard, Monroe County Sheriff's Department, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we worked together to focus on those areas. So that would be an example of how we're effective in what we're doing. Now, how do we know we're effective at what we're doing? I could go out there and run donuts in the water all day long with a boat and use gas. Am I effective in what I'm doing? So what we're trying to do is figure out, okay, try to get a baseline. All right, we're going to go here to this geographic area at this certain time, this certain date, during this certain fishery, and check everybody or check a certain amount of vessels. Then we're going to try to go back later on and see if we did compliance assistance while we were there, if we did compliance assistance in between those two time periods, and then check the the effectiveness of the compliance rate at the first time and the compliance rate at the second time. Is it more effective? And that's how we think we found a way to figure out if what we're doing is effective. If I go out there on a Sunday in October and check a certain amount of boats in a geographic area, and we have a 50% compliance rate, and then I do compliance assistance and outreach at the local fishing store or something that could be within the next couple months, and go back to that same area, that same time, maybe that same day for the next year, maybe 6 months later, and I have a 75% compliance rate. I would like to think what I did before is what helped that. So that's where the effectiveness comes into play. And then the impact, it is what it is. It protects and conserves our marine protected areas, coral reefs, and protected resources, sustains fish stocks, prevents IUU harvesting, prevents illegal trafficking of fish and wildlife, and it levels the playing field. If people are doing things right, then the other people should be doing it right as well. And nobody should be getting any monetary gain for doing it illegally. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Win. Thank you for this excellent presentation about the role of NOAA, OLE, and major strategies and ways to confront and meet the objectives that you have. And thank you also for the work that you do and your office does protecting the nation's living resources. So the next panelist is Monica Goldberg. Monica is the Chief Counsel for Environmental Defense Fund. She leads the U.S. Oceans Program on legislative and administrative initiatives and oversees litigation undertaken by the program. She holds a JD magna cum laude from Harvard Law School and a BA in political science from Berkeley. And, Monica, all yours.
Thank you. Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. As Zhao noted, I'm the Chief Counsel of the Oceans Program. I should say we have a Chief Counsel of the entire Environmental Defense Fund. It's definitely not me. She spends a lot of time litigating clean air matters. Mm-hmm. So I do oversee, I oversee our advocacy in all three branches of the U.S. government. And also, as we have started to, so like many ENGOs, EDF focuses our oceans work on fisheries. And as the U.S. has started to get a handle on overfishing and recovering overfished species, we've expanded the geographies we work in fairly substantially. So I also have started to do some policy advice and assistance to folks working out there. And a couple of the examples I'll discuss today relate to some of our international activities. So that's been an exciting area of expansion for us. At all times, we really try to find solutions that align the incentives for fishermen and other resource users to comply with environmental regulations so that you get truly durable and transformative responses. And so that's kind of the underpinning of a lot of the work that all of EDF's programs do, is taking a incentive, trying to get those incentives aligned, and it's definitely relevant in the MPA context. Let's see, can I make it? There it goes. So of course we don't enforce just for the sake of enforcement, right? We set up MPAs to give ourselves the benefits we're looking for, and this is an infographic courtesy of our friends at the World Wildlife Fund that talks about the benefits specific to fisheries. And you can see that they're pretty substantial if they are complied with, if the restrictions that are inherent in MPAs are complied with. And unfortunately, the world is really home to a lot of well-designed, scientifically well-designed MPA systems that haven't delivered the benefits folks have hoped for because they were created without a lot of stakeholder input that creates the buy-in for folks to comply with those restrictions. And as Wynn pointed out, like, there's a shortage of resources always, and with all of the best tools and technologies, you still have limitations on how much you're able to do. So for us, we feel that the secret sauce, at least with respect, especially with respect to coastal marine ecosystems, is to work with fishermen and other stakeholders and combine well-designed MPA reserves with well-designed fisheries management, so you have the incentive for effective compliance systems. And we've worked in a couple of countries recently that epitomize this approach. So the first one is Belize. EDF, with a lot of other groups, have been working in Belize for several years, and that's our staffer, Nick Ricania, in the wetsuit there. And this progress there has been slow but steady. I mean, like I said, we've been there for, I think, a solid decade, and we're not alone. There have been a lot of people working in Belize, but you're really starting to see how the progress can be made. So EDF and colleague NGOs, both based in Belize and in the United States, worked extensively and directly with local fishing communities in the formulation of ideas that led to the first trial sites. So we worked directly also with Belize government to demonstrate that these ideas would improve the implementation of their fisheries management and their MPA programs together. And actually went so far as to fund certain staff members within the Belizean government, which is kind of unusual. I was surprised to hear that, actually. So we had two pilot programs originally were established in the Port Honduras and Glover's Reef MPAs. Each of those included fishing and non-fishing zones, and they really started to show the fishermen that using that combination would lead to better outcomes for them. One of the systems that we worked with folks in Belize on and have worked in other jurisdictions on is called a TURF, or a territorial use rights to fisheries fishing. I think that's what it stands for. Basically, it gives a particular group of fishermen the opportunity to, the right to fish in an area and to exclude other fishermen from that area. So usually it's centered around a particular community, but in Belize, they can actually self-select to pick one or two turf areas to fish in. So one of the ways that helps align the incentives is as for example, if a reef recovers or you start to see increase in population of particular species like lobster or snails especially, or reef associated fish, the benefits from that will accrue to the fishermen in that area. So they can directly see the connection between their efforts and the uptake. So the results were really strong, and in combination with outreach efforts to a lot of other fishing communities and the government, they have expanded the program to all of Belize's territorial waters. And today, these are relatively recent headlines. I feel like they're maybe from January. I should know this. Okay, April 2019. So today, Belize has a nationwide system of fishing zones and to which fishermen self-associate and MPAs, and together it covers their entire terrestrial sea. The two reinforce each other and create the incentives for fishermen to respect the MPAs because, as I said, they increase the value of the turfs. And they've actually perceived that to be enough of a benefit that they pushed for this expansion of MPAs, which they originally were targeting 10% of Belizean waters. They ended up putting 12% of their territorial sea into MPAs. And there, I have like links to these articles. If you read them, they're very proud of the fact that those MPAs were actually in coastal zones as opposed to far offshore. So they are places where people might ordinarily choose to fish, but they have set them aside to recover the fisheries and the reef itself. So you have a combination of the government, and interesting, the combination of government and NGO management of the protected areas themselves, but enforcement stays with the government. So that's a fisheries management regulation itself is still a governmental function, including enforcement. So the results, we have local fishermen largely comply with the MPA restrictions. Most illegal fishing is coming from poaching by fishermen from other countries, which is an issue. And that's one of the reasons, speaking to the enforceable demarcation, they actually went all the way out to the edge of the territorial sea so that there would be a clear demarcation between where things were managed and not managed. But so in other words, the needs for enforcement definitely doesn't go away, but it's materially reduced from previously when they had no take reserves without having the complementary fishing regulations that gave the incentive to the fishermen to comply. So another example is in Moabal in the Cebu province of the Philippines. So this is a little bit different situation because it involves ecotourism. So as we know, recovering from overfishing a lot of times requires reducing the intensity of fishing effort for a period of time. And that creates a lot of contentiousness in the United States. In other geographies, it can be even harder for folks because they rely on fisheries for really their basic income needs. So providing a alternative source of livelihood can be a really important way to incentivize folks or basically make it possible for them to reduce fishing intensity and allow things to recover. So if we think about ecotourism as a potential alternative income source, that does require often an intact and healthy ecosystem, and that intact and healthy ecosystem also could involve reduction in fishing intensity within those areas. So those restrictions are going to be tough to implement if you have potentially weak governance in the area, which is true in a lot of the geographies where we work, and especially if the local fishermen do not, or the fishery stakeholders, be they fishermen or community members, don't see the benefit of those. So you can think about more extractive forms of ecotourism that put a lot of the benefits leaving the community. So, but here in the Philippines, in a project that we worked on and evaluated, the ecotourism is very local, and as opposed to the usual megafauna, charismatic megafauna that ecotourism tends to focus on, it is actually it's based on a charismatic herring shoal and a fringing reef system, which provides the basis for a network of marine reserves. So, and I found this picture at the last minute because I said we have to see a picture of the shoal. So, fortunately, various occupations associated with the ecotourism resource, such as driving tourist boats, watching over the marine reserves, are accessible to fishermen and can help them deal with potential reductions in fishing effort that are necessary. And it turns out that those occupations are actually much more valuable than the fishing itself would have been. So using a combination of regional and local economic statistics and stakeholder surveys, EDF implemented an economic valuation of the Moabal marine ecotourism in 2018 and found that the sector provides an estimated 20.7 million United States dollars in revenues annually to the community and supports employment for approximately 1,000 community members, including some fishermen. But in contrast, we estimate the extractive value of the herring shoal would be just about 1% of that. And I can't do the math to translate these numbers, but anyway, 1% of it compared with the flow of benefits from the ecotourism. So as a result, you can see that these herring shoals are not exactly challenging to catch. There's a lot of fish in one place, but in general, the fishermen do respect the no fishing admonition within the MPAs that are designed to protect them. So shifting gears a little bit, and also shifting back to the United States, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was how technology can help us deal with the challenges that climate change is going to produce in terms of effective MPA design and enforcement. So some of the best known US MPAs are designed to protect swordfish nursing areas. And these were set up mostly in the 90s when US swordfish were overfished. As you all may know, North Atlantic swordfish has recovered, which is great. The closures remain in place. For example, the Charleston bump is right there. That's closed from February 1 to the end of April, covers the entire South Carolina coast and most of the Georgia coast. So these are set up because the idea is that that was a nursery area where juvenile swordfish would grow up, and obviously it's timed as well. But as climate change starts to change the temperature, prey composition, and other characteristics of these areas, are they correctly sited and timed? Is a question for all of these areas. Some of them are for bluefin tuna in the Gulf, but I think most of them are for swordfish. I was actually involved in litigation that set up the Charleston bump closure, so more about that. So technology can help answer those questions. The West Coast, this is actually an example from the West Coast. This is called the EcoCast, and it's a program that uses observer data and conditions in the marine environment like temperature, sea surface temperature, and chlorophyll to predict where fishing vessels will likely encounter sea turtles, sea lions, and sharks. So data collection of this kind can help managers assess the location of MPAs, like the swordfish nursery areas, as well as the timing of them, and whether to move them or their timing as ocean conditions change or areas with higher juveniles or other things shift. Overall, the more timely, accurate, and comprehensive data that electronic monitoring and reporting systems can provide could give regulators a chance to design these in a different way. I will also say that in some cases, and we've been involved in some of these efforts, fishermen are arguing that you can have a hard cap on the amount of fish that you catch and enough monitoring that they can use these tools to avoid the fish and avoid the need for the closed area in the first place. But that gets a little bit out of ourselves. So going back to an international example, so we were talking, you were talking earlier about the combinations of different technologies to help enforce regulations, including MPAs. And for one, I've been a huge fan of Global Fishing Watch since it launched, and looking forward to John's presentation on the eyes in the sky aspect. We are also currently scoping a project that would use hydrophones and radar to generate sufficient information to deter deter illegal fishing in Chile's nearshore ecosystem, especially of something called loco, which means, you know what that is? Yeah. Oh, yeah, this says a species of marine snail. Oh, close. So the idea is that you can have a low-cost combination of various technologies that combined, and also with artificial intelligence software that can provide real-time updates to enforcement folks so they can target their outreach in those areas where illegal fishing is taking place. And sort of the longer-term vision is that we have these additional technology, is whether we can combine these technologies with other data like satellite data to actually generate enough information to become the basis for enforcement actions on their own. Right now, I think it's, like you say, directing human resources to the right places, also shaming not to be, can also be a good tool. But ultimately, the sort of holy grail is to find a way to have this be a basis for enforcement action itself. And here again, we are counting on collaboration with the fishermen, because all of the estimated illegal catch is taken off the top of the legal quota. So again, the fishermen will be incentivized to help enforce these restrictions so their higher catch can be implemented. And these are also areas that EDF already has relationships with fishermen, where we're working on turf reserves and things like that with them. So we're hopeful that it'll be an interesting combination of, again, the enforcement and the fishing regulations reform. And I will try to answer any questions you may have, although you can tell I'm spread thin, covered I bring a lot of things. And ultimately, I'm a policy, not a technology person, but I'm happy to talk about some of these examples and our overarching hope that technology can really help us accomplish some of these goals.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica, for this overview of all the work that EDF is doing on MPA management and your approach to some of the uses of new technologies for more effective MPA management and enforcement. I'm really interested in the project in Chile. I mean, the local fisheries, the way the regulation is constructed is an example for sustainable small-scale fisheries management, but we know that the lack of enforcement has been a major challenge for that. So I would like to know how that project goes.
Indeed, level the playing field, as you said. For legal fishermen.
Exactly, that's right. So with that, we turn to our third panelist, John Amos. John is the president and founder of SkyTruth, an organization that is dedicated to strengthening environmental conservation by illuminating environmental problems and issues through the use of remote sensing and imaging. He helps develop organizational strategy and partnerships for SkyTruth, mentors technical staff, and provides remote sensing expertise. John holds an MS in geology from the University of Wyoming and a BS in geology from Cornell. John, honors.
Thank you, Shane. I'm going to stand up because I just can't sit down and talk. I don't know why. Almost every presentation I'm standing up somewhere. So please, if you want to join me, feel free. Thank you, Zhao. Thank you for this follow-up to the MPA Enforcement Handbook work. I mean, that was a really interesting project to do. I hope you all have a chance to dig into that if you're interested in this topic. And I'm really glad to be back and give a little a follow-up on how the technology has changed since we did that just a couple of short years ago. I think, you know, in terms of the work that I do at SkyTruth, I have to pause and think about the mentoring of technical staff. I think that mostly consists of me saying things that make them laugh uproariously now. So more of what I do is things like this, and I let the technical team do what they're going to do. I'm here to talk about the work that we do at SkyTruth using the view from space to inspire environmental protection and to make advocates more effective in the work that they do. As you've heard already, there are lots of technologies to apply to understanding what's happening on or in or under the surface of the water. We have passive sonar, we have drones, there's all kinds of equipment and sensors that are being developed and deployed. I'm going to talk about none of that and confine my remarks to what we can do with the hardware toolkit that we're putting into orbit. And I also want to point out this is really still about monitoring. We can't actually do enforcement from space yet. I think we're heading in that direction pretty quickly. But it's my hope that by deploying credible, continuous global monitoring systems, and that almost certainly requires space-based platforms to accomplish that at scale, that we will make the enforcement problem a lot smaller because people change their behavior when they know they're being watched. So that's our hope. It's maybe a bit naive, but we'll see what happens, as the president likes to say. So two of the main satellite technologies we work with are satellite collected tracking data and satellite imagery. I'm going to start with the tracking data. So it turns out that if you put a radio frequency receiver on a satellite, you can actually collect the radio frequency broadcasts that ships are making down on the ocean surface to each other, particularly the broadcasts using a system called Automatic Identification System, AIS. This was developed as a collision avoidance safety system, a way for ships to communicate to each other, who they are, how big they are, where they are, how fast they're going, those kinds of things. And it also turns out to be very useful for understanding what's happening on the ocean and for increasingly designing and conducting management regimes that take advantage of this tracking data system. Lots of ships use it because they're required to. Lots of ships that aren't required to use it because they don't want to get run down in the middle of the night by a car carrier full of Hondas charging across the ocean. But still, there's a sizable dark fleet of commercial users of the ocean space who, even though they may be required to use this system, they're not. They're running dark. Well, if you plot the locations of all of the broadcasts, AIS broadcasts that are made by the 200,000 or so ships at sea who are broadcasting on any given day, you can come up with this really stunning, or depending on how you look at it, appalling map of human activity in the ocean and the pervasiveness and intensity of the human footprint in the ocean. But it can be a lot more informative once you get past the shock and awe of it to actually home in on a select set of vessels, a specific geography, and a particular time frame, and then you can start to do some interesting things. For example, you can start to see vessel activity associated with extraction in the ocean. The era of seabed mining is coming quickly. This is a site we worked on with UC Santa Barbara to actually take a known fleet of vessels that are supporting ocean surveying and exploration activity that will lead to seabed mining, and track their movements as they go from port out to the mining concession areas to do whatever activities they're going to do. Of course, oil and gas exploration and development in the ocean is still a huge form of human activity out there. This is a track of a single offshore seismic surveying vessel that was working in the mouth of Cook Inlet last week. I think they're still out there. And what this allows you to see with this single track is that not only is the AIS tracking data useful for telling us that there's a ship there and telling us who they are and what they say their activity is that they're engaged in. By reconstructing the way they're moving on the water, we can see patterns of behavior that tell us what they're doing out there in the ocean. And if we apply artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning, to identifying those patterns across a global data set at scale, you can do some magical things. And so that's what we did when we built Global Fishing Watch. We actually taught computers how to recognize how a vessel's movement pattern changed when it put gear in the water to actually start to fish. And so every point of light on the Global Fishing Watch map that you're seeing here, that's animating, I think, about 2 years of cumulative fishing activity. Every point of light is not a fishing vessel. It's fishing effort by a fishing vessel. Some 60,000 fishing vessels making up the collective fishing effort that you're seeing on this map. We're learning to do a lot more with tracking data also. One of the patterns of behavior we see that's also of interest within the global fishing industry is apparent vessel rendezvous at sea. Rendezvous at sea can be perfectly innocent. Crews can be, swapping crew in and out. They can be trading recipes. They can be shifting supplies from one vessel in a fleet to another. But it's also a way to shift fish that was caught by one vessel onto a cargo ship or a processing ship for return to port, or even onto another fishing vessel that can take it somewhere else. And so it's a way to actually hide illegally caught fish within the still all too opaque global seafood supply chains. Shifting to the other kind of data that we use, we've done a lot of work at SkyTruth since we were started, using satellite imagery as a tool to monitor oil pollution events out in the ocean. And this particular example is a type of satellite imagery that we find really useful for pollution monitoring. This is a radar satellite image. Radar is very sensitive to the roughness of the sea surface. So when you put oil in the ocean, it smooths it out, it makes it slick. And that shows up as a dark patch on a radar image. And so what we've got here is the Niger Delta, Nigeria, and then a large oil slick that was coming from an incident at a Shell deep water production facility several years ago. But it's not just offshore oil platforms that cause oil spills in the ocean. All too frequently when we look at satellite imagery, particularly radar imagery of the ocean, we see this. This is a 100-kilometer long oily slick that was left by a passing vessel that was illegally dumping untreated bilge water out of the hold, out of the cargo holds or the bilge tanks of the ship to get rid of it. It's the cheapest, easiest way to get rid of it. Doing this out in the ocean used to be the equivalent of sweeping something under the rug that you didn't want anybody to see. But with this technology now, we're able to see it and bring it to light. So those are some of the things that we've been doing with satellite technologies at SkyTruth. Where are we going? What are we working on right now? Well, another great thing about that radar satellite imagery is it's really sensitive to big hunks of metal sitting out in the ocean. They show up as very bright points of light on a radar satellite image. And so we now have access to a public, free, globally available data set of radar satellite imagery through the European Space Agency. And so at SkyTruth, we've automated a process to identify all those bright points of light out in the ocean that don't move, that are in the same place week after week after week, and create this. This is a global map of human-built offshore infrastructure in the ocean. Oil platforms, wind turbines, big floating fish farms. So all the red dots that you see are pieces of human hardware sitting above the waterline out in the ocean. Not only is this useful for taking a look at a kind of a different look at the expanding human footprint out in the ocean, and you can imagine all the vessel activity to and from each of these little red dots to support its construction, and then whatever operation is happening there. It's also useful for us at SkyTruth to help us identify the sources of the oil pollution events that we're seeing on satellite imagery. Did that come from an oil platform, or did it come from a passing vessel, or did it come from something else? One of the things we're able to do now with automation is actually merge different data sets together. And so here's a very simple and obvious example of that. We've got about a 140-mile-long bilge slick left by a vessel. It turns out you can actually see the vessel at the end of the slick on this radar satellite image, that bright spot. You can't tell much about a vessel by that bright spot. You can tell roughly how big it is and what direction it was moving, and maybe the speed it was moving, but that's a big ocean-going cargo ship or tanker. When we integrate that with the AIS tracking data for the 200,000 vessels around the world that are broadcasting it, we can identify a culprit. And increasingly, we're able to kind of point fingers and name names when we see pollution events like this, and identify a likely perpetrator, those scofflaws who are continuing to bilge dump throughout the oceans. Well, what about all the vessels out there that, as Wynn had mentioned, are not broadcasting an AIS tracking signal? There's still a lot of traffic in the ocean that is part of what we call the dark fleet of non-broadcasting vessels. Well, we're starting to light those up with satellite imagery. So here's a project we're doing this year, funded by the Walmart Foundation, to actually assess the risk of human rights violations in the longline tuna fleet in the Pacific. And SkyTruth's part of that work is to measure how much dark fleet activity is embedded within the tuna fishers who are broadcasting a tracking signal and acting legitimately. And so here's an example that's very ugly radar satellite image, but very effective. It shows a series of blue dots. These blue dots plotted on the image are areas where there was an AIS signal that was broadcast, but no vessel appeared on the image. So that's kind of strange. We've got an AIS ping, but no ship visible on the image. Well, you look at how these pings are arranged, and what these are signaling buoys or beacons that are attached to the gear, to the drifting long lines that these tuna fishermen are deploying, so that they can go back and retrieve their gear without searching around in the ocean for it. The green dots show where we detected a vessel on the image. We had a bright spot on the image that was obviously a vessel, and we were able to correlate it with an AIS tracking broadcast. Those guys are in the light fleet. They're broadcasting their activity. They're not the ones we care about. These two red dots, though, are the ones we care about. That's where we see ships on the image, but could not confidently correlate that with any AIS broadcast. And so those are potentially dark fleet vessels that are embedded within the legitimate longline tuna fishing fleet. And the imagery is just getting more and more spectacular. This would have been unbelievable to me when I started my remote sensing career, but this is a high resolution color infrared satellite image that was taken of a vessel that we thought was potentially engaged in a transshipment. And that vessel is this big refrigerated cargo ship in the middle. And based on the AIS signal it was broadcasting, it looked like it came to an almost complete halt out in the middle of the ocean off Madagascar. And we went, okay, there's only one reason for a big cargo ship to come to a stop out in the middle of the ocean, assuming they're not having engine problems. And so we collected this high resolution satellite image, 30 centimeter level detail, and there are two non-broadcasting dark fleet fishing vessels tied up alongside the cargo ship. And there's enough detail on these images, if you know a vessel structure and configuration, that you might actually be able to make some identifications now, just based on satellite imagery alone. Again, we're not quite at the level of doing enforcement from space, but clearly we're getting closer and closer to that. This floors me. It partly scares me and amazes me, but now military and intelligence grade electronic signals intelligence has come to the civilian remote sensing world. So this company, Hawkeye 360, is one of the first out of the gate. We've got a cluster of satellites in orbit now that can detect any strong radio frequency signal coming from anywhere on the surface of the Earth, and they can triangulate the location. So let's say you're a pirate fisherman and you don't want to broadcast an AIS signal telling the world, here I am. You've turned that off. You're not following any VMS tracking regulations, and you're out there fishing illegally. Somebody on the crew's got to call home every now and then. And when they pick up a sat phone and make that call, bam, Hawkeye 360 can detect that a call was made. We're not eavesdropping on the content, but now we're able to say, hey, there was electronic activity down there in that spot just 5 seconds ago. Do you know who that is? So that's what's coming now. We're starting to work with this data, and it's fascinating and scary. So what we've been doing most recently is finding ways to actually directly measure behavior from space. Not just presence, but try to figure out behavior. What are they doing? Not just who they are, but also, who are they? So if we can make the behavior and the identification, then we've got the basis to send somebody a notification. And we're working now to automate every step of that process, including the notification to any authority or NGO or other stakeholder who wants to be notified of the information that we can collect. I'm going to wrap it up now with this bit. I love this picture. It's actually a fairly old picture now. It's a few years old. But there's just more and more hardware going into space. It is getting really difficult as a remote sensing professional for me to keep a handle on all the companies that are flinging hardware into orbit. And I mean flinging. These are two 18-inch long satellites that were thrown by a mechanical arm out of the International Space Station. They're being launched by SpaceX 60, 100 satellites at a time in a single launch. We're rapidly approaching junkyard Earth, I guess. This is an artist's representation, thankfully not to scale, of all of the pieces of floating hardware that are being tracked by NORAD right now. Mostly defunct satellites, but a few thousand active ones, growing by leaps and bounds every day. So all of this is going to get better and more intense, and yes, a little scarier. And the secret to being able to manage this already flood of data, becoming an impossible torrent of data and imagery to handle, the secret to this is automation. So it's applying artificial intelligence, specifically machine learning, and for imagery, the technique we call computer vision, to train computers to sort through all this stuff lightning fast, and then send human eyes a notification that maybe you want to look at this thing down here right now. And I'm giving you a little sneak preview. This is behind the scenes at Global Fishing Watch Labs. This is what they're working on now, basically going beyond just vessel tracking data to develop a platform where you can do predictions. Where is the fishing effort going to be? Not where is it today, not where are those vessels pinging AIS right now, where are they going to be pinging AIS tomorrow and next week? And so here's an example of This is cumulative long line fishing activity over, I think, about a month. And this is just, this is the Galapagos Islands right in here. And that's superimposed on a map of ocean temperature at 20-meter depth, a color-coded map. We now have data where we can essentially daily create maps like this of ocean temperature at multiple different levels in the ocean, some of which are significant to certain fish species, some of which aren't, and all kinds of other data, oceanographic data, geophysical data, with the intent of training the computers how to recognize in the past the combination of conditions that have facilitated fishing activity of a specific type. And so when we see those conditions now, or assembling now in the future, planning enforcement patrols based on where we think the fish are going to be, and therefore the fishing effort is going to be. I mean, possibly, and I'm going to leave it with this is pie in the sky right now, but possibly even designing dynamically managed marine protected areas in the ocean that are based not on, Wynn, you're going to hate this, based not on straight lines, based on lots of amoebas out in the ocean that are constantly shape-shifting and moving as the ocean itself changes. And that raises the possibility of a marine protected area defined by a set of continuously observable and measurable conditions, like this. Like maybe, you know, this orange blob on this kind of a temperature gradient, you would follow that as it tracks across the ocean with El Nino or back and forth, and you would say, that's my protected area. An enforcement nightmare. And but I think that's where this technology is all heading. It creates a possibility, at least, to think about. And I think that's enough.
Great.
Wow.
Well, thank you so much, John. It's always fascinating to hear the work that you're doing. And of course, I always get very excited when I think about all the possibilities that your work brings to regulatory policy making. Thank you. So we turn to questions now. I think we're going to start with the ones that we are here in the room and then move to questions from the audience online. So time for questions.
Right.
We have one here.
Hi. Has there been any case law related to enforcement actions where an enforcement vessel is engaged in hot pursuit from a sanctuary using either VMS, AIS, or maybe another emerging technology?
I mean, we've made cases before like that, where we get VMS data that a vessel is in a marine protected area, and we get out there, whatever unit it would be, Coast Guard or a state partner or one of our vessels, and it takes off. There have been cases made from that. I don't know if there's been any case law made from that, but there have been cases made from those types of situations.
Anything international?
Not that I know of. There's potentially out there, but not necessarily anything I know of.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions in the room?
Wait, can I follow up on that real quick?
Of course.
Actually, internationally, we were involved in a hot pursuit in Palau, and we had been from Shepherdstown, West Virginia. We had been tracking I think it was a Taiwanese trawler, but don't get mad at me if I get the nation wrong, Taiwan. But it was a trawler that had been operating without a license, and clearly based on their movement behavior, they were fishing within Palau's waters. And so Palau called us at 6 in the evening one night as we were all getting ready to go home, saying, okay, we launched our patrol boat. Now where do we go? And at the time they had a 50-foot inflatable patrol boat to patrol out to the 200 nautical mile EEZ, this vast area. And so we're like, okay, we really want to help these guys. So our analyst worked well past midnight, basically getting live updates of the AIS position, because this vessel was broadcasting an AIS signal. And again, I think people who are engaged in illegal activity, they had it on for safety purposes, and they never faced any consequences in the past. But So Bjorn was radioing or emailing positions to Palau, who were relaying it to the captain out on the boat, and they actually triangulated and made an interception 12 miles from Indonesian waters and pulled that boat back in, and it had a load of shark fin on board. And they ended up paying, I think, about a $300,000 fine, which for Palau is pretty huge, and kind of put down the marker that okay, we can do this now. So the case itself wasn't determined by the data, but that was one of the rare examples when we were able to do some real-time direction of steel on inflatable rubber on the water to get the job done. But that's anecdotal. It's not systematic. We're not quite there yet.
Thank you. I just wanted to know whether any of the panelists are working on the BBNJ negotiations that are going on at the United Nations in terms of creating MPAs in areas beyond national jurisdictions. And I was thinking some of the stuff that you've been working on would be very relevant there. Thank you.
No. EDF is not.
SkyTruth is not either.
Yes,
No,
but
also
it's clear that could be very useful.
Well, they need to call.
Give them a call.
We're very small and very busy.
Thank you. That was one of the questions in my list also. So thank you for asking that.
We'll jump online for a question. I believe this is directed for Monica. Are turfs traded, or are they solely among fishers or government agencies?
It depends on how you want to design them. I think that my understanding is, in general, they tend to be limited to a geographic area or a defined universe of fishermen who either can access that or not. I suppose in theory you could trade them if there was a reason folks wanted to, for example, among family members or people moving in and out of the community. You know, the more limitations you have on trading, the less valuable the license is to the license holder. So at the same time, if you're trying to design the system so that you can keep fishing effort limited and geographically based, then you could have limits on transferability that would achieve those objectives. So it's really usually it's about how the community or how the regulatory body wants to design the program and what kind of objectives they're trying to accomplish.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question to that on the same topic of turfs. What are some other incentives for stakeholders like turfs to comply with more marine protected areas enforcement?
Well, apart from the ecotourism version, I mean, I think a lot of these systems, even if they don't have turfs, you will have spillover effects from the MPAs. So then those benefits, which are kind of consistent across MPAs, if you don't limit the number of people that have access to the benefit, the people who are sacrificing aren't necessarily the ones who are getting it if they draw in fishermen from other areas. So that's why we feel like if you have a limitation on, if you have sort of more ownership, if you will, of the outcome that you're getting from the MPA, then you have more incentive. But at all times, a well-enforced MPA is likely to result in some of the benefits from the WWF slide on spillover effects into outside the area. So there's always that incentive. It's just a question of whether it's limited to a certain number of people so that it's more intense for those folks to get that incentive.
Thank you. And we'll take one up front.
Thanks, and thanks so much to all the panelists. I mean, this was really, really interesting. Kind of an obvious theme of all of the presentations was the potential for the transition of using remote sensing technology from interdiction to prosecution. And I was wondering what the panelists see as the key challenges to making that transition, assuming we all agree that would be a useful thing. I think two obvious ones that emerged from the presentations. John, you mentioned the technology is evolving. We can observe more and more specific behaviors on the water, but we're still waiting for that technology to continue to develop. And then when you alluded to, I think, the need to design a regulatory framework where the predicate violation is observable through remote sensing technology. So you have to design it in a way that it's enforceable. Two others that came to my mind would be resolving chain of custody issues when you have private entities, NGO partners that actually hold the evidence. How does that find its way into a prosecution? And then developing an enforcement framework. I mean, these vessels don't always wind up offloading their catch and are not always subject to the enforcement authority of the jurisdiction that's carrying out the remote sensing. So how do we confront those challenges? Are there any others that didn't make that list? Sorry for the long question, but thanks.
Yeah,
You should have been up here.
Yes, excellent question. Thanks.
Well, to answer your question, we deal with that already with our regular domestic work, with the evidence. Say there's a stranded whale or a dolphin that comes up on the beach, and the stranding network comes and gets the gear. How do we work on making sure that evidence is like we need it, and that we can use it in the court through seizure, through chain of custody, and all that kind of stuff. And I guess the best answer is it depends. And you probably don't hear that, but what we do is we try to work with our partners, whether it be a state partner or whether it's an international partner, the NGOs, whoever who gets that evidence, and make sure that it's useful in the court of law. So we do that all the time. And then we have our people go to our academies to try to learn that as well. So as far as I think you said regulatory framework, remote sensing technology, as far as putting eyes on it, what makes it tough is, again, like I said, they have these areas that you can fish, or that you can't fish, or a specific permitted vessel can be in that area and fish, but another vessel can't fish in that area, and it makes it tough. And the reason why those laws are the way they are, the regulations are the way they are, is to me, is a lot of it is trying to make the fishing opportunities as large as possible, while keeping it sustainable, making everybody happy on the council, the fishermen, the NGOs, and all that kind of stuff. And then we're caught in the middle from an enforcement perspective. And we got to figure out, is today Tuesday? And if the boat has 2 engines running, then it's good to go. But if I only have 1 engine running, then it can't fish there. So that's what we have to determine. And that's why we keep on with our collaboration and our talking. We'll see a law come out, and we'll put the brakes on. It's like, whoa, let's think about this. But sometimes it doesn't matter what we think, depending on the powers to be. But anyhow, did I answer some of your questions? Okay. Yeah, it was long, but I was trying to write everything.
Well, and I would just add that a lot of the examples that we gave there about having stakeholder buy-in and enhanced compliance and things like that were centered in some of the other geographies where we work, but it's definitely relevant in the United States as well. Like you said, I mean, these very Byzantine regulations that come out of the council process, and I've been there when they've basically said, oh, it's not enforceable, oh well, like I'm just gonna keep do it. And to the extent that you have the fishing community or the broader community, stakeholder community bought in, and do more self-policing, that's the goal. But and I would just say that also with monitoring, like electronic monitoring and electronic reporting, is less about tracking and more about catch accounting usually. But one of the tensions that we've seen is that from an enforcement point of view, you might want to keep that data, keep that video forever, because you can then go back and reconstruct things later. But number one, the fishermen don't like that. Number two, the cost goes up when that happens. So there's also the balancing of, how much data can you keep and sort through, and what are the costs of that, and how does that make you able to make cases or not make cases.
And who pays for it.
And who pays for it, fishermen or government. And because some of these storage is not supposed to be an issue anymore these days, it's pretty cheap, but with video, that's a very sizable file. So yeah, you would know more about that, John.
Yeah, we still have those problems. Just a couple of thoughts. One is that, coming back to that visual, that high resolution satellite image visual of that vessel, I think that was a 30 centimeter resolution image. So that was the best commercially available, about like that. That's just going to continue to shrink. And so one of the former Coast Guard commander told me that when they were doing patrols, one of the things that was considered actionable evidence, and maybe you can confirm this, Wynn, was fishing gear on the deck of the vessel. If it was not stowed, that was sign of fishing activity. Does that sound right?
You know, a lot of it depends on our regulations, what they say. Sometimes there's a regulation, and the law will say it is assumed that if there is gear on the deck that you are fishing.
Right.
And then that helps us out.
Right.
But sometimes the specific law may not say that.
So that's exactly where, you know, the laws need to match what's observable, and the laws are always going to lag behind that somewhat. But I think what's observable is becoming, you know, more and more detailed. So the technology may create some legal space for new approaches. The other thing is there needs to be much better intentional coordinated data sharing. So you've heard people say VMS a number of times, vessel monitoring systems. That's the closed government vessel tracking system that's satellite encrypted. I think the fishermen have to pay for it and don't like it. And, you know, you plug it into the ship's power and then you don't touch it. And that's all managed and controlled by whatever government authority is managing that system. And then in the US, it's the Coast Guard that manages the VMS data. Is that right?
No, it's actually us.
Oh, it's you. Okay, yeah. And I know it's really hard.
We're the ones that regulate it, and you know, it's within our regulations for them to do. The AIS is going to be on the Coast Guard side. The VMS is going to be on our side. And
I know it's really hard to even share that data within government agencies because of the privacy protection in the authorizing legislation for it, right?
That's what we have in our regulations under Magnuson Act and stuff is how we share it, who we share it with, and so forth. And, that makes it tough even when we're dealing with international regulations with, you know, again, ICAT and those places. So
that could be changed theoretically. I think it would require an act of Congress in our case to make the VMS shareable, but other countries don't necessarily have that problem. So Global Fishing Watch has a transparency play where they're going around to all the coastal nations and saying, okay, make your VMS data public for the whole world to see it. And the benefits you're going to get from that are it'll appear on our map and all your analysts will actually be able to see it and work with it rather than having it stuck in a box. And interesting things pop out when people start to actually see the data. So from Indonesia, one example was a vessel that we tracked on AIS traveling across the ocean to a notorious pocket of the high seas off Papua New Guinea, where a lot of bad stuff is believed to happen. But the VMS data that we had access to showed it in port the entire time. So somehow they'd taken the VMS system off the boat, put it down on the dock, left it on, and then trucked thousands of miles across the ocean. And so when you combine those data sets, you start to see these interesting things happening. Now, maybe they weren't doing anything necessarily illegal, but certainly you'd want to go pay them a visit when they come back into port. And if that's publicly visible to the world, doesn't matter if they are coming into a port in Indonesia, a port in China, or a port in France. Somebody, if there's that level of communication among port authorities internationally, somebody's going to know that maybe they should say hello and start looking at paperwork.
Great. If I might add just a quick comment on / question, building on your excellent question. Do you think also, a question for the three of you, do you think also that part of this transition sort of towards the use of technology for prosecution would be working with the judges to make sure that the judges are convinced that they can, you know, like, trace the dots from the actor to the action and be convinced themselves that, okay, this is fine.
I think that's something ELI should definitely do.
Okay, that was the evil agenda behind my question. Okay, so I think we're out of time, but maybe we could have one final question.
I was going to say, if there's time for one final question from the room. If not, I'd just like to thank you all so much for lending your time and experience to our panel, as well as for joining us both in person and online. And thank you so much for your great questions. We'll hope you'll continue to think and learn about the benefits and challenges of technology and marine protected areas enforcement. I want to extend an enormous thank you to our panel, Zhao, Monica, and John. Thank you so much for lending your leadership and expertise to today's event. And thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.